The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew something was wrong before I even answered. Not because of intuition or some mystical connection to the universe, but because it was the fourth call from St. Mary's Regional Medical Center. In 3 hours, and I'd been too terrified to pick up any of them. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I was 26 years old, lying in a hospital bed 3 states away from anyone I'd ever called family. The surgery had been scheduled for weeks. A tumor removal that my doctor, Dr. Patricia Kellerman, had described as concerning but treatable, in that careful way doctors speak when they're trying not to scare you but also need you to understand. This isn't exactly routine. I'd driven myself to Sacramento from my apartment in Fresno because St. Mary's had the specialist I needed, and because I couldn't afford to miss work for multiple consultations. The plan was simple: check in Monday night, surgery Tuesday morning, recover for 2 days, drive home Thursday. Clean, efficient, manageable. I'd handled everything alone before. This would be no different, except surgery had complications. What was supposed to be a 2-hour procedure stretched into 6 hours. The tumor was larger than the scans showed, wrapped around tissue they hadn't expected. Dr. Kellerman later told me they'd managed to remove everything, but I'd lost more blood than anticipated and my body had reacted poorly to the anesthesia. Instead of waking up groggy but stable, I'd spent 18 hours in and out of consciousness while they monitored my vitals. When I finally really came to, it was Tuesday evening and a nurse named Caroline was adjusting my 4-drip. She had kind eyes and spoke in the soft, patient tone of someone who delivered difficult news many times before. She explained that they'd tried to reach my emergency contact multiple times. They'd left detailed messages. They'd even tried calling during business hours in case there was a work schedule conflict. My emergency contact was my father, David Martinez. I'd listed him not because we were close, but because he was the only family member whose phone number I actually knew by heart. We hadn't spoken in 4 months. Before that, it had been 6 months. Our relationship existed in these long stretches of silence punctuated by brief, uncomfortable conversations usually centered around some crisis or obligation. Caroline told me they'd finally reached him that morning while I was still unconscious. The conversation had been brief. She'd explained that I was his daughter, that I'd undergone emergency surgery, that there had been complications, and that I was currently in intensive care. She'd given him the hospital information and asked if he could provide any additional medical history that might be relevant to my treatment. His response, according to Caroline's notes, had been immediate and clear: "Not my problem. Don't call this number again." Then he'd hung up. I stared at the ceiling tiles after she told me this, counting the small holes in each square panel. There were 247 holes per tile, and I could see 12 complete tiles from where I lay. I did the math: 2,964 holes. It seemed important to know this number, to focus on something concrete and quantifiable while the rest of my world felt like it was dissolving. Caroline left me alone for a while after that. I appreciated her understanding that some news requires processing time. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the distant hum of hospital machinery. Through the window, I could see a parking structure and beyond that, the Sacramento skyline. People going about their normal Tuesday evening routines, unaware that 3 floors up, a 26-year-old woman was trying to reconcile the fact that her own father had explicitly told medical professionals that her life-threatening surgery was not his problem. The thing is, I wasn't entirely surprised. Disappointed, hurt, angry, yes, but not surprised. This was consistent with who David Martinez had always been, at least in relation to me. What surprised me was how much it still managed to sting, even after years of conditioning myself to expect nothing from him. Dr. Kellerman came by around 8 that evening for her final rounds. She was a tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct manner that immediately inspires confidence. She'd been the one to explain the complications earlier, and now she was here to discuss recovery and next steps. The surgery went well overall, she said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. We removed the entire mass, and the pathology results should be available in a few days. You'll need to stay until Friday for observation, longer if there are any setbacks. Do you have someone who can drive you home and stay with you for the first week of recovery? I opened my mouth to give her some version of yes, some reassuring lie about having support systems in place, but nothing came out. The weight of being completely alone in a situation that wasn't supposed to be handled alone suddenly felt crushing. Dr. Kellerman waited patiently, then asked gently, "Is there anyone else we can call? Another family member? A close friend?" "There's my brother," I said finally. "Marcus. But he's in the Navy, stationed in Virginia." And my sister Emma lives in Portland with her husband and kids. She's busy. The word busy carried so much weight. Emma and I had grown up close, but adult life had pulled us in different directions, and she'd made it increasingly clear that my problems weren't convenient for her carefully structured suburban routine. What about friends? A partner? I thought. About my friend Rachel from college, but she lived in Chicago now with a demanding job in marketing. There was Miguel from work, but we weren't that kind of close. Sarah from my yoga class seemed genuinely kind, but I barely knew her beyond our Tuesday evening conversations about poses and breathing techniques. The truth was, I'd spent the last few years building a life that was efficient and self-contained. I worked as a graphic designer for a small firm, mostly remote work that allowed me to avoid office politics and complicated relationships. I lived in a studio apartment that I could afford on my own. I had routines and hobbies that didn't require coordination with other people. I'd convinced myself this was independence, but lying in that hospital bed, I realized it might just have been isolation. I can manage, I told Dr. Kellerman. I'm used to handling things myself. She studied my face for a moment, and I could see her making calculations. How much should she push? What was her responsibility here beyond the medical aspects of my care? Jessica, she said finally, I've been doing this for 23 years. Surgery like what you've had, even when it goes perfectly, requires proper recovery support. This isn't about being tough or independent. This is about medical necessity. Before I could respond, there was a knock on the door. Caroline poked her head in. Dr. Kellerman? There's a phone call for you at the nurse's station. They say it's urgent and related to Ms. Martinez. Dr. Kellerman excused herself, and I was left alone again with my thoughts and the ceiling tiles. I wondered who could possibly be calling about me. The only people who knew I was here were the medical staff, and I'd specifically asked them not to try reaching my family again after Caroline had relayed my father's response. Through the thin hospital walls, I could hear fragments of Dr. Kellerman's conversation. Her voice was professional but with an edge I hadn't heard before. She was asking questions, taking notes, occasionally saying things like "I see," and "That's quite unusual," and "Are you certain about this information?" When she returned 15 minutes later, her expression was completely different. Where before she'd looked concerned but routine, now she looked like someone who'd just received news that changed everything. Jessica, she said, sitting back down and leaning forward slightly, that was a very interesting phone call. It seems your father's response to our contact has triggered some unexpected attention. I felt my stomach drop. What kind of attention? Are you familiar with an organization called the Martinez Family Trust? The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head. Well, Dr. Kellerman continued, apparently you should be. That call was from an attorney named Thomas Brennan. He represents the trust, and he's been trying to locate you for the better part of 2 years. She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. Jessica, I think there are some things about your family that you don't know. And based on what Mr. Brennan just told me, your father's decision to hang up on the hospital might have been the biggest mistake of his life. The ceiling tiles seemed to blur as I tried to process what she was saying. 2 years? A trust? An attorney who'd been looking for me? I don't understand, I said quietly. Dr. Kellerman pulled out her phone and showed me a number. Mr. Brennan is driving here from San Francisco tonight. He'll be here first thing in the morning, and he says he has some documents you need to see. Documents that explain why your father was so quick to disown you today, and why that decision might have just cost him everything. Outside my window, the Sacramento skyline was beginning to twinkle with evening lights. Somewhere out there, people were having normal Tuesday night dinners, watching television, helping their kids with homework. And here I was, recovering from surgery I'd faced entirely alone, being told that everything I thought I knew about my family was apparently wrong. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow morning would bring. What kind of documents could possibly explain a lifetime of feeling like an unwanted burden? What kind of trust had my name attached to it without my knowledge? And most importantly, how was it possible that my father's cruelest moment might somehow become the key to understanding why my life had always felt like I was fighting an uphill battle against people who should have been in my corner? The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time until morning, until answers, until whatever revelation was waiting for me in a manila envelope carried by a stranger driving through the California night. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by nurse checks and the weight of questions I couldn't answer. When morning arrived, I felt like I'd been awake for days, my mind racing through decades of memories I'd never thought to question before. Thomas Brennan arrived at exactly 8:30 a.m., just as the breakfast trays were being distributed throughout the ward. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of expensive suit that suggested serious legal business. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen years of important meetings, and when he shook my hand, his grip was firm but gentle, like someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "Ms. Martinez," he said, settling into the chair beside my bed, "I want to start by saying I'm sorry about your surgery and the circumstances that brought us together. This isn't how I'd planned to make contact, but sometimes life forces these moments upon us." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, the kind that holds years of accumulated paperwork and secrets. "What I'm about to tell you will probably sound impossible at first. Your father's response to the hospital yesterday wasn't just cruel. It was legally significant in ways he doesn't understand." I shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed, still weak from surgery but suddenly very alert. "I don't follow. Your paternal grandmother, Isabella Martinez, died when you were 3 years old. Do you remember her at all?" The question caught me off guard. I had vague impressions of an elderly woman with soft hands and a musical laugh. Someone who used to sing Spanish lullabies while braiding my hair. But those memories felt more like dreams than actual recollections. "Barely," I admitted. "My father never talked about her much. He said she was difficult, that she played favorites." Thomas nodded grimly. "That's one way to characterize what happened. The reality is more complicated." He pulled out a photograph from the folder, a black and white portrait of a distinguished-looking woman in her 70s. Isabella Martinez was a remarkable person. She immigrated to California in 1952 with nothing but determination and a gift for understanding people's true character. The woman in the photograph had intelligent eyes and a slight smile that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. Thomas continued, "She worked as a seamstress for 30 years, saved every penny, invested wisely in real estate during the 1960s when properties in Sacramento were still affordable. By the time she retired, she owned 17 rental properties throughout Northern California." This information didn't align with anything I'd been told about my family's financial history. My father had always portrayed us as working-class people who struggled to make ends meet. He'd used that narrative to explain why I needed to start working at 14, why college would have to be paid for entirely through scholarships and loans, why family vacations were impossible luxuries. "She was also incredibly perceptive about family dynamics," Thomas said. "Particularly concerning your father and his relationship with money and responsibility. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." He handed me a legal document, yellowed with age but still clearly legible. "This is her will, drafted in 1995, 2 years before she passed away. She left very specific instructions about her estate, including a provision that was quite unusual for its time." I scanned the document, trying to make sense of the legal language. One section was highlighted in yellow, in recognition of the cyclical nature of financial responsibility within families, and having observed concerning patterns of dependency and entitlement, the primary inheritance shall be held in trust for the grandchild who demonstrates genuine independence and self-sufficiency by age 25, without knowledge of this provision. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Thomas. "What does this mean?" "It means your grandmother was watching how your father raised his children, and she didn't like what she saw. She noticed that Marcus and Emma both developed a sense of entitlement about money, always expecting bailouts and support without taking genuine responsibility for their choices. But you were different." Thomas pulled out another document, this one more recent. "She set up a complex trust that would only activate under very specific circumstances. The beneficiary had to demonstrate financial independence by age 25, had to be supporting themselves without family assistance, and most importantly, had to be genuinely unaware of the inheritance." My head was spinning. Why would she require that I not know about it? Because she'd seen what the promise of inheritance did to other family members. She watched Marcus coast through high school expecting college to be paid for, watched Emma make poor financial decisions because she assumed there would always be a safety net. Your grandmother believed that real character only emerges when people think they're truly on their own. He showed me a detailed report that looked like it had been prepared by a private investigator. It contained information about my life that I'd never shared with anyone, my work history, my education financing, my living situations, even details about how I'd budgeted and saved for this surgery. For the past 7 years, an investigative firm has been monitoring your financial independence at your grandmother's instruction. Every scholarship you earned, every job you worked, every month you paid your own rent without family help, it was all being documented. The implications of this were staggering. While I'd struggled through college working 3 part-time jobs, while I'd eaten ramen for months to save up for security deposits on apartments, while I'd felt guilty for being the family member who never asked for help, someone had been watching and taking notes. You qualified for the inheritance on your 25th birthday last year, Thomas continued. The trust attempted to locate you through your father, since he was listed as your most recent emergency contact. But every time they called, he told them you were irresponsible, financially unstable, and not worth their time. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How many times did they try? 17 calls over the past 14 months. Each time, your father gave them misinformation about your character and your financial situation. He told them you were unemployed, that you dropped out of college, that you had drug problems and couldn't be trusted with money. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Everything I'd believed about my relationship with my father was being reframed in real time. It wasn't just that he was distant or emotionally unavailable. He had been actively sabotaging opportunities one didn't even know existed. Why would he do that? Thomas's expression grew more serious. Because the trust had a backup provision. If you were deemed unfit or unreachable, the inheritance would default to your father as the next of kin. He's been positioning himself to inherit your grandmother's estate by convincing the administrators that you were incapable of handling it. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I'd experienced during the surgery. Physical pain was straightforward, manageable with medication and time. This was something else entirely. This was the systematic destruction of opportunities by the one person who was supposed to advocate for me. There's more, Thomas said gently. Yesterday, when the hospital called about your surgery and your father said it wasn't his problem, that conversation was recorded by the hospital's standard procedures. When my office contacted them to verify your identity and location, they provided that recording as part of their patient advocacy protocols. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the bedside table. That recording is legally significant because it demonstrates your father's explicit renunciation of parental responsibility. According to the trust documents, any heir who publicly disowns or abandons a potential beneficiary automatically forfeits their claim to serve as backup inheritor. My mind was reeling. So by hanging up on the hospital, your father eliminated himself from inheritance consideration while simultaneously providing the documentation we needed to prove you were both reachable and in need of medical support. The irony is profound. Thomas handed me another document, this one crisp and new. As of this morning, you are the sole beneficiary of the Martinez Family Trust, which includes 17 rental properties, 3 commercial buildings, a stock portfolio, and approximately $2.3 million in liquid assets. I stared at the numbers on the page, but they felt abstract, like a fictional story about someone else's life. The woman who'd driven herself to Sacramento for surgery, who'd been prepared to recover alone in a studio apartment, who'd worked every day since she was 14, was apparently a millionaire. Your grandmother left detailed instructions about the inheritance, Thomas continued. She wanted you to understand that this money comes with both opportunity and responsibility. She also left you a personal letter. He handed me an envelope with my name written in careful script across the front. Inside was a handwritten note on delicate paper. My dear Jessica, if you are reading this, it means you have proven yourself to be exactly the person I believed you could become. You have learned to stand alone, to work hard, to make your own way in the world without expecting others to carry you. These are rare qualities, and they are worth more than money. But money, used wisely by someone with your character, can create opportunities to help others and build something meaningful. Your father and siblings never understood that wealth is a tool, not an entitlement. Use it well. With all my love and admiration, Abuela Isabella. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words by the end. Through the hospital window, I could see the same parking structure and Sacramento skyline as the night before. But everything had changed. The world looked exactly the same, but I was suddenly a completely different person with completely different possibilities. Thomas was packing the documents back into his briefcase, but he moved slowly, giving me time to process. There are practical matters to discuss when you're ready, he said. Property management, tax implications, investment strategies. But for now, you should focus on recovering from surgery. What happens to my father? I asked quietly. Nothing. Punitive, Thomas replied. He simply doesn't inherit what he was never entitled to in the first place. His lie about your character, his attempt to intercept your inheritance, and his abandonment of you during a medical crisis are all documented now, but there are no legal consequences beyond losing access to money that was never his. After Thomas left, I lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling tiles again. But instead of counting holes, I was thinking about choices. For 26 years, I believed I was the problem child, the one who couldn't maintain close family relationships, the one who'd somehow failed to earn love and support. Now I understood that I'd been fighting a rigged game all along. My father hadn't been distant because I was difficult. He'd been sabotaging me because my success threatened his financial plans. The family dynamics that had confused and hurt me for years suddenly made perfect sense through this new lens. But more than understanding the past, I was beginning to glimpse a different kind of future. One where I could make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. Where I could help people without depleting my own resources. Where I could build the kind of life my grandmother had envisioned when she made those careful, loving plans for someone she'd barely had time to know. The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of medical consultations, legal paperwork, and phone calls that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. Dr. Kellerman had cleared me for discharge on Friday morning, but Thomas suggested I extend my stay through the weekend to handle the most urgent trust business while I was still in Sacramento. By Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in a conference room 3 blocks from the hospital, surrounded by people whose job it was to manage assets I'd never imagined owning. There was Margaret Chen, the trust administrator who'd been overseeing my grandmother's estate for nearly 3 decades. Robert Walsh, a financial advisor who specialized in sudden inheritance cases. And Linda Reeves, the property manager who'd been maintaining the rental buildings and sending monthly reports that my father had been intercepting for over a year. The portfolio has performed exceptionally well, Margaret was saying, sliding a thick binder across the mahogany table toward me. Your grandmother had an intuitive understanding of long-term investment strategy. She bought properties in neighborhoods that were undervalued but showed signs of future growth. The rental income alone generates approximately $48,000 monthly. I stared at the numbers, trying to process what monthly rental income of that magnitude actually meant. It was more than I'd earned in entire years during college. More than my current annual salary as a graphic designer. It was the kind of financial security that transformed every decision from a careful calculation into a genuine choice. The commercial properties are particularly valuable, Linda added, opening her own folder filled with photographs and financial statements. There's a small shopping center in Roseville, a medical office building in Davis, and a warehouse complex in Stockton. All fully occupied, all managed by reputable property management companies under long-term contracts. Robert leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. Jessica, I work with people who come into money suddenly fairly often. Lottery winners, insurance settlements, unexpected inheritances. There's usually a period of adjustment, sometimes disorientation. You don't have to make any major decisions immediately. But even as he said this, I could feel something shifting inside me. Not disorientation, but clarity. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't calculating whether I could afford something. Instead, I was thinking about what I actually wanted to do. I want to see the properties, I said suddenly. All of them. I want to meet the tenants, understand what my grandmother built. Margaret smiled. She would have liked that. Isabella was very hands-on, even in her 80s. She knew every tenant by name, remembered their children's birthdays, helped families through difficult periods by adjusting rent or deferring payments when necessary. Over the next 2 days, Linda drove me throughout Northern California in her practical Honda sedan, visiting each of my grandmother's properties. What I discovered was extraordinary. These weren't just investment vehicles or income streams. They were communities that Isabella had carefully cultivated over decades. At the apartment complex in Roseville, I met Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who'd been living in Unit 2B for 8 years. She told me how my grandmother had helped her through a period of unemployment by allowing her to work off partial rent by maintaining the building's garden and common areas. The property was immaculate, filled with families who'd been there for years, people who spoke about Isabella Martinez with genuine affection and respect. The medical office building in Davis housed a family practice clinic, a pediatric dentist, and a physical therapy center. Dr. Andrew Kim, who ran the family practice, explained how my grandmother had kept their rent below market rate because she believed healthcare should be accessible to working families. When a corporate medical group had offered to buy the building for twice its assessed value, Isabella had declined because she didn't want to displace the doctors who served the community. At each property, I heard similar stories. Tenants who'd been helped through difficult times. Small businesses that had been able to establish themselves because of reasonable rent and a landlord who cared more about stability than maximum profit. Families who'd watched their children grow up in apartments they could afford because Isabella Martinez understood that housing security was the foundation of everything else. But the most revealing visit was to the warehouse complex in Stockton. The property manager there, Frank DeLuca, had been working with my grandmother for 15 years. He was a straightforward man in his 60s who clearly didn't sugarcoat anything. Your grandmother was tough but fair, he told me as we walked through the well-maintained facility. She expected tenants to pay on time, keep their spaces clean, follow the lease agreements. But she also understood that small businesses face challenges that big corporations don't. She gave people opportunities to prove themselves. He showed me files documenting how Isabella had worked with struggling tenants, sometimes restructuring payment schedules, occasionally accepting partial payments during slow seasons, always with clear agreements about making up the difference. The result was an occupancy rate of 98% and tenant relationships that averaged over 7 years. About 2 years ago, Frank continued, some guy started calling about the properties. Said he was handling your grandmother's affairs. Wanted to know about cash flow, market rates, whether we could increase rents or sell to developers. Real pushy, kept asking about maximizing returns. My stomach tightened. Did he give you a name? David something. Said he was Isabella's son, that she was getting too old to manage things properly. Wanted us to start sending reports and payments to him instead of directly to the trust office. Frank led me to a small office where he kept his records. Margaret. Chen called me personally after one of his calls. She was very clear that this David person had no authority over the properties and that we should continue all business exactly as before. She also asked me to document any future contact attempts. He pulled out a file labeled Unauthorized Contact Attempts and handed it to me. Inside were detailed notes about 17 different phone calls from my father over the past 18 months. The progression was clear: initial inquiries about property values, then demands for financial information. Then increasingly aggressive insistence that he had legal authority to make management decisions. The final note was dated just 6 weeks ago. Caller became hostile when informed that property information could only be released to authorized trust administrators. Stated that Jessica Martinez was irresponsible and unstable, and that he was protecting the family's interests. Advised caller that all properties were performing well and that no management changes were needed. Call ended abruptly. Reading these notes felt like watching a chess game where I'd been unaware I was even a player. While I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, working overtime to afford basic medical care, my father had been positioning himself to inherit assets worth millions. Every time I'd called him for emotional support or family connection, he'd known he was actively working to prevent me from accessing resources that could have transformed my life. Frank, I said quietly, what did my grandmother tell you about me? His weathered face softened. She talked about you quite a bit, especially in her last few years. Said you were the one who got her spirit, her work ethic. She was proud that you were making your own way, even though she knew it was harder than it needed to be. He paused, looking out the window at the warehouse complex my grandmother had built from nothing. She used to say that anyone could manage money if they inherited it young and easy. But it took real character to earn it yourself first, then use it wisely. She was watching you prove yourself, Jessica. Every job you worked, every bill you paid on your own, every time you didn't ask your family for help. She saw all of it. On the drive back to Sacramento, Linda and I rode mostly in silence. I was processing not just the financial reality of what I'd inherited, but the emotional weight of understanding how much my grandmother had believed in me at times when I'd barely believed in myself. There's something else you should know, Linda said as we pulled into the hospital parking garage. Margaret asked me to wait until you'd seen the properties before telling you this. She handed me another envelope, this one sealed and marked. Personal instructions from Isabella Martinez. Inside were handwritten pages in my grandmother's careful script, dated just 3 months before her death. My dear Jessica, by the time you read this, you will have seen what I built and met the people whose lives are connected to these properties. You will understand that wealth is not just about money, but about responsibility to community. Your father sees only dollar signs. Your brother and sister see only what they can take. But you have the gift of seeing people, of understanding. That true success comes from lifting others up alongside yourself. The properties are yours not just to own, but to continue in the spirit they were created. Help people build stable lives. Give families the security I never had as a child. Use this foundation to create something even better than what I managed to build. And remember, Mija, that the greatest revenge against those who tried to diminish you is simply to flourish without them. That evening, back in my hospital room for what would be my final night, I called Thomas Brennan. Margaret had provided me with his direct number and told me he was available whenever I needed legal guidance. I want to do this right, I told him. Not just the business side, but the spirit of what my grandmother intended. Can you help me understand how to honor that while also protecting myself legally? Absolutely, Thomas replied. In fact, Isabella left very specific suggestions for exactly this transition. She anticipated that you might want to expand on her work, possibly establish formal programs for helping tenants, maybe even acquire additional properties with a community focus. Over the next hour, he outlined possibilities I'd never imagined. scholarship programs for tenants' children, small business incubation spaces, affordable housing development, community centers that could provide services and gathering spaces. My grandmother had built the foundation, but she'd envisioned me constructing something even more ambitious on top of it. There's also the matter of your family's response to all this, Thomas said carefully. Word has a way of traveling, especially regarding financial matters. Are you prepared for what might happen when they learn about your inheritance? I thought about my father's systematic sabotage, his willingness to let me suffer through surgery alone, his 17 phone calls trying to intercept my inheritance. I thought about Marcus and Emma, siblings who'd treated me like an inconvenience for most of our adult lives but who would undoubtedly have very different attitudes towards someone with significant assets. Let them find out naturally, I said. I'm not going to announce it, but I'm not going to hide it either. They made their choices about how to treat me when they thought I had nothing. Now we'll all get to see what those relationships were really based on. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of completion. Not just recovery from surgery, but recovery from a lifetime of believing I wasn't worthy of love, support, or security. My grandmother had seen something in me that I'd barely been able to see in myself. She'd trusted me with not just money, but with the responsibility of continuing her legacy of community building and compassionate property management. Tomorrow I would leave the hospital and begin a completely different life. Not just because I had resources now, but because I finally understood my own worth. The woman who'd driven to Sacramento alone for surgery was gone. The woman who was leaving had been transformed not by money, but by the recognition that someone had believed in her potential long before she'd learned to believe in it herself. The explosion came exactly 18 days after I returned home to Fresno. I'd been expecting it, but the ferocity still caught me off guard. I was sitting in my studio apartment, which suddenly felt absurdly small given my new financial reality, when my phone started buzzing with an intensity I'd never experienced. 15 missed calls in 10 minutes, all from family members who hadn't bothered to contact me during my hospitalization. The texts that followed painted a clear picture of how word had traveled. Emma had apparently run into Linda Reeves at a coffee shop in Davis. Linda, not knowing the family dynamics, had mentioned meeting Isabella's granddaughter and how impressed she'd been with my plans for the properties. Emma had played dumb, asked innocent questions, and walked away with enough information to piece together what had happened. The first call I answered was from Marcus, my brother, calling from his Navy base in Virginia. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Is it true? He demanded without preamble. Did you somehow get Abuela's money? I could hear other voices in the background, suggesting he wasn't alone. Hello to you too, Marcus. I'm recovering well from surgery, thanks for asking. Cut the sarcasm, Jessica. Emma says you inherited millions. Properties, investments, the whole thing. How is that possible when Dad said Abuela died broke? The question revealed how thoroughly my father had deceived his own children. What exactly did Dad tell you about her estate? That she'd spent everything on medical bills, that there was nothing left except debts. He said he'd had to pay for her funeral out of pocket, that it nearly bankrupted him. Marcus paused. Are you telling me that was a lie? Before I could respond, I heard a commotion in the background and suddenly my father's voice came through the phone. He must have driven to Virginia, or been visiting when the news broke. Let me talk to her, David Martinez said in the commanding tone he'd used throughout my childhood. Jessica, we need to discuss this situation immediately. There's nothing to discuss, Dad. You made your position very clear when the hospital called. That was a misunderstanding. I was dealing with work stress, I didn't realize how serious your surgery was. The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that I almost admired his audacity. You told them it wasn't your problem and hung up. The hospital has it on record. Look, family arguments aside, we need to talk about your grandmother's estate. There are legal issues you don't understand, tax implications that could destroy everything if not handled properly. I could hear Emma's voice in the background now too, apparently she'd driven or flown to Virginia as well. The Martinez children were circling the wagons, but this time they were circling around money instead of family crisis. The estate is being handled by professionals, Dad. The same trust administrators who've been managing it successfully for 3 decades. Those people don't understand family dynamics, my father pressed. They're outsiders who'll charge fees and make decisions that hurt everyone. Your grandmother intended for the family to manage these assets together. The rewriting of history was breathtaking. Actually, I have her personal letters explaining exactly what she intended. She wanted someone who'd proven financial independence and good character. Someone who wouldn't treat inheritance as an entitlement. The silence that followed was loaded with implications. Finally, Emma's voice came through, and I could tell she'd taken the phone from Marcus. Jess, honey, I think there's been some terrible miscommunication here. Dad says the lawyers contacted him about problems with Abuela's estate, about how you were refusing to cooperate with the family's legal representation. Emma had always been the family diplomat, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts with emotional manipulation disguised as peacekeeping. Her tone was saccharine, the voice she used when she wanted something but didn't want to admit it directly. There are no problems with the estate, Emma. Everything is exactly as Abuela planned it. But surely she didn't intend for one person to control everything? That doesn't sound like her at all. She always talked about family unity, about taking care of each other. I found myself laughing, a sound that apparently carried clearly through the phone because the background conversation stopped abruptly. Emma, when was the last time any of you took care of me? When was the last time you called to check how I was doing, or offered help with anything, or even remembered my birthday without Facebook reminding you? That's not fair, she protested. We all have busy lives, responsibilities. Right. You have responsibilities. But somehow I was supposed to drop everything whenever any of you needed something. Remember when you called me at 2 a.m. because your babysitter canceled and you needed someone to watch the kids? I drove 4 hours each way on a work night to help you. That was different, that was an emergency. And my surgery wasn't? The question hung in the air. I could hear whispered conversation in the background, rapid strategizing about how to approach this differently. My father's voice returned, and his tone had shifted from commanding to calculated. Jessica, I know you're hurt about the hospital situation. I've been thinking about that, and you're right to be upset. I was wrong. I'm prepared to apologize publicly, to make amends for that mistake. The offer was so transparently tactical that it was almost insulting. What kind of amends? Financial support for your medical bills, for one thing. And I think we should all spend more time together as a family, maybe plan some trips, create new traditions. With whose money? The question clearly flustered him. Because his response came too quickly. Well, if you're in a position to help the family get back on solid footing, I think your grandmother would have wanted that. She always believed in family loyalty. There it was. The real agenda laid bare. Not remorse for abandoning me during a medical crisis, not genuine interest in rebuilding relationships, but a calculated attempt to access assets they'd counted on inheriting themselves. Dad, I need you to understand something very clearly. You spent over a year lying to the trust administrators about my character and my situation. You told them I was irresponsible, unemployed, unstable. You tried to intercept an inheritance that was never yours while I was working 60-hour weeks and saving for basic medical care. That was protection, Jessica. I was trying to protect you from making financial mistakes you weren't ready for. The gaslighting was masterful in its completeness. He'd somehow reframed systematic sabotage as parental protection. Protect me from what? From being able to afford decent health care? From not having to work 3 jobs in college? From having some financial security? Emma's voice came through again, more desperate now. Jess, please, we're family. Whatever mistakes were made, we can work through them. But cutting everyone out isn't the answer. Think about what this is doing to Mom. I'd been wondering when they'd bring up my mother. Patricia Martinez had been notably absent from this conversation, but Emma's mention of her suggested a different kind of pressure was coming. Where is Mom in all this? I asked. She's devastated, Emma said quickly. She's been crying for days, saying she feels like she failed you somehow, like she didn't raise you to turn your back on family. The manipulation was so predictable it was almost boring. Make the victim responsible for the abuser's emotional state. Frame reasonable boundaries as cruel abandonment. Position manipulation as love and resistance to manipulation as heartlessness. Put her on the phone, I said. She's too upset to talk right now, but maybe if you came home, if we could all sit down together in person. No, I said firmly. If Mom wants to talk to me, she can call me directly. But I'm not going to be ambushed by a family meeting designed to pressure me into funding everyone else's lifestyle. The background conversation became more heated. I could hear my father's voice rising, Marcus arguing with someone, Emma trying to maintain her diplomatic facade while clearly frustrated. That her emotional manipulation wasn't working. Finally, Marcus came back on the line. Jessica, I'm going to be direct here. Dad borrowed money against his expectation of inheriting Abuela's estate. Significant money. If that inheritance doesn't materialize, he's going to lose the house. This information was new, and it explained a lot about the desperation in my father's approach. How much money? Enough that bankruptcy might be the only option if the situation doesn't get resolved quickly. I felt a moment of something that might have been sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by clarity about what was really happening. So Dad gambled. On receiving an inheritance that was never promised to him, and now he wants me to bail him out with money that he tried to prevent me from getting. When you put it like that, it sounds worse than it is. How exactly would you put it? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, more honest. Look, I didn't know about any of this until yesterday. The lying to the trust people, the hospital thing, none of it. But regardless of what Dad did, we're still family. Emma's got 3 kids, Dad's got serious debt, Mom's got health issues. You have the resources to help everyone get stable. And what do I get in return? You get to be the hero. You get to be the person who saved the family. The offer was revealing in its assumptions. They still saw me as someone who could be motivated by the promise of approval, someone who would sacrifice her own interests for the chance to finally be valued by people who'd never valued her before. Marcus, I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it. I've worked myself to exhaustion trying to be helpful enough, selfless enough, useful enough to matter to this family. Do you know what I got for it? What? Abandoned in a hospital bed while you all had family day without the drama. The silence that followed was different. Less calculating, more uncomfortable. I could hear Emma saying something in the background, probably trying to redirect the conversation back to financial solutions. I need you all to understand, I continued, that my relationship with this family is not for sale. Not for any amount of money, not to solve anyone's financial problems. Not to restore some fantasy of family unity that never existed in the first place. Emma took the phone back. Jessica, you're being incredibly selfish right now. I understand that you're hurt, but you're talking about letting your own father lose his house. The same father who told medical professionals that my life-threatening surgery wasn't his problem. People make mistakes when they're stressed. This wasn't stress, Emma. This was character. I could hear my father's voice in the background, more agitated now, demanding the phone back. When Emma handed it to him, his diplomatic facade had completely dropped. Jessica, you have 1 week to reconsider this attitude. 1 week to remember where you came from and who raised you. If you don't start showing some family loyalty, you're going to find out what it really means to be on your own. The threat was so absurd that I almost laughed again. Dad, I've been on my own my entire adult life. The difference now is that I finally understand it was by design, not by accident. I hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. The apartment felt different after that conversation. Smaller, but also somehow more peaceful. I'd been dreading this confrontation for weeks, but now that it was over, I felt relieved rather than upset that they'd shown their true nature completely. Not one expression of concern about my health, not one genuine apology for the hospital abandonment. Not one moment of actual family connection. Just immediate, naked greed dressed up as family loyalty and emotional manipulation disguised as love. I made myself dinner and ate it slowly, thinking about my grandmother's letter about flourishing without them. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I understood what she meant. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about finally being free to build authentic relationships with people who actually cared about my well-being rather than my usefulness. Tomorrow, I would start looking for a house. Something with space for the life I was ready to build, in a place where I could create genuine community instead of trying to force connection with people who saw me only as a source of solutions to their problems. The escalation began 3 days later with a knock on my apartment door at 6:30 in the morning. Through the peephole, I could see Emma standing in the hallway with someone I didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase and clipboard. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. Emma? What are you doing here? We need to talk, Jess. This is Rebecca Walsh from the County Mental Health Services. I filed a petition for a welfare check because I'm concerned about your mental state following your surgery and the stress of this inheritance situation. The woman beside Emma stepped forward, showing her credentials through the gap in the door. Ms. Martinez, I'm Rebecca Walsh, a licensed clinical social worker. Your sister has expressed concerns about your recent behavior and decision-making patterns. I'm here to conduct a brief assessment to ensure you're receiving appropriate mental health support. I stared at Emma through the narrow opening, hardly believing what I was witnessing. You called social services on me? I called them for you, Emma corrected, her voice taking on that familiar tone of righteous concern. You've been isolating yourself, making rash financial decisions, cutting off family members who love you. These can be signs of post-traumatic stress or depression following a medical emergency. Rebecca Walsh consulted her clipboard. According to the information provided, you underwent major surgery recently and have since made significant life changes including property acquisitions, family estrangement, and possible financial mismanagement. Your family is worried that you might be experiencing psychological symptoms that are affecting your judgment. The sophistication of this attack was impressive. Emma had clearly done research into how mental health evaluations could be weaponized, probably hoping to replicate my father's failed conservatorship strategy with a different approach. "I'm not required to speak with you without my attorney present," I said to Rebecca Walsh, "but I'm happy to clarify the situation. I recently inherited property from my grandmother, which I'm managing with the help of professional financial advisors and trust administrators. My family is upset because they expected to inherit these assets themselves." Rebecca Walsh made notes on her clipboard. "And the family estrangement began when my father told hospital staff that my life-threatening surgery wasn't his problem and refused to provide medical support or even acknowledgement that I was hospitalized." I could see Emma shifting uncomfortably as I provided this context. Her version of events had clearly painted a different picture. "What specific behaviors has my sister reported that concern you?" I asked. Rebecca Walsh consulted her notes again. "Withdrawal from family relationships, refusal to communicate about financial matters, possible hoarding of resources that could benefit other family members, and what was described as erratic decision-making regarding property management." The translation was clear. I was being pathologized for setting boundaries, protecting my inheritance, and refusing to fund my family's lifestyle. Emma had essentially reported me for the crime of financial independence. "I'd like to call my attorney," I said. "And I'd like to understand what authority, if any, you have to compel this evaluation." Rebecca Walsh's demeanor shifted slightly. "This is a voluntary welfare check based on a family member's concerns. You're not required to participate, but refusing could be noted in the report." The implied threat was obvious. Cooperate with this inappropriate evaluation, or have your refusal to cooperate documented as further evidence of mental instability. "I'm going to call my attorney now," I said, closing the door. Behind the locked door, I could hear Emma and Rebecca Walsh talking in low voices. Emma was clearly trying to convince the social worker that my response proved her point about erratic behavior and paranoia. Thomas Brennan answered on the second ring. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and decisive. "Don't open the door again. Don't engage in any discussion with the social worker. I'm calling the county supervisor right now to file a complaint about the misuse of welfare check procedures for what appears to be inheritance harassment." Within an hour, Rebecca Walsh was gone, but Emma remained in the hallway, alternating between knocking and calling through the door. "Jess, please, I was just trying to help. I'm worried about you. You're not acting like yourself." "How would you know how I normally act?" I called back. "When was the last time you spent more than 10 minutes talking to me about anything other than what you needed? That's not fair. We've always been close." The delusion was so complete that I almost felt sorry for her. Emma genuinely seemed to believe that our relationship had been meaningful, despite years of evidence to the contrary. My phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Emma had apparently shared my contact information with people as part of her campaign to paint me as mentally unstable. The first call I answered was from Janet Morrison, Emma's mother-in-law. "Jessica, honey, Emma is so worried about you. She says you've been making some very concerning decisions lately." "What kind of decisions?" "Well, cutting off your family, for one thing. And Emma mentioned you're spending money recklessly, maybe getting taken advantage of by financial advisors who don't have your best interests at heart." The narrative was spreading and evolving. My careful management of inherited properties was being reframed as reckless spending. My decision to work with professional trust administrators was being characterized as vulnerability to exploitation. "Janet, did Emma mention that my father refused to acknowledge my hospitalization for major surgery?" "She said there was some miscommunication about that, but that he's very sorry and wants to make things right." The rewriting of history was systematic. My father's explicit abandonment was becoming a miscommunication. His calculated attempts to intercept my inheritance were being erased entirely. I hung up and immediately called Margaret Chen at the trust office. "I need you to document something," I said, explaining the morning's events. "My family is now attempting to use mental health services to challenge my capacity to manage the inheritance." Margaret's response was swift and professional. "We'll prepare a comprehensive documentation package showing your competent management of the estate, including all correspondence with property managers, tenants, and financial advisors. We'll also have Dr. Kellerman provide a statement about your mental state during and after your hospitalization." That afternoon, Thomas called with an update. The county supervisor was not pleased to learn that welfare check procedures were being misused for family financial disputes. "Rebecca Walsh has been reprimanded, and there's now a note in the system that any future reports concerning you should be scrutinized carefully for harassment patterns." But Emma wasn't finished. That evening, I discovered she'd created a GoFundMe page titled, "Help My Sister Through Mental Health Crisis." The description was a masterpiece of manipulative storytelling. My sister Jessica recently underwent major surgery and inherited a large estate from our grandmother. The stress of these changes has caused her to experience what appears to be a psychological break. She's cut off all contact with family members who love her, made impulsive financial decisions, and is refusing professional mental health support. We're raising money to hire private counselors and intervention specialists to help her get the treatment she needs during this difficult time. The page had raised nearly $3,000 in its first few hours online, with dozens of comments from people expressing sympathy and offering prayers for my recovery from whatever breakdown Emma had convinced them I was experiencing. I screenshotted the entire page and sent it to Thomas, who responded with a single word: defamation. Within 6 hours, the GoFundMe page was gone. Emma had received a cease and desist letter, and I had legal grounds to pursue damages if she continued spreading false information about my mental health, but the damage to my reputation in Emma's social circle was significant. I started receiving concerned calls from acquaintances who'd seen the page before it was removed, people who'd known me casually for years and were shocked to hear about my apparent psychological crisis. The most painful call came from Sarah, the woman from my yoga class who'd always been kind to me. "Jessica, I saw something online about you going through a difficult time. I just wanted you to know that if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Her genuine concern made me realize how isolated I'd become in my effort to manage this family crisis privately. "Sarah, I'm okay. My family is upset about an inheritance situation, and they're trying to make me look unstable to gain access to money." "That's terrible. I'm so sorry you're dealing with that. The worst part is how effective it's been. People who barely know me are now convinced I'm having a mental breakdown because my sister is a gifted storyteller." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You know, this explains something that's been bothering me. Emma called me yesterday asking questions about your behavior in yoga class, whether you'd seemed depressed or anxious lately, if I'd noticed any personality changes." The revelation was chilling. Emma had been systematically contacting people in my life, gathering information she could use to support her narrative of mental instability. She was building a case against my mental health the same way a prosecutor might build a case against a defendant. "What did you tell her?" "That you seemed like the same person you'd always been. Quiet, thoughtful, maybe a little reserved, but certainly not unstable or erratic." She seemed disappointed by that answer. That evening, Marcus called from Virginia. His tone was different, more frustrated than manipulative. "Jessica, you need to call Emma and work this out. She's completely out of control." "She's out of control?" "She flew back to California yesterday and spent the day calling everyone who's ever met you, trying to get them to say you're acting crazy. She called my commanding officer, for God's sake. Told him I was worried about my sister's mental health and might need emergency leave to deal with a family crisis." The scope of Emma's campaign was becoming clear. She wasn't just trying to convince me to share the inheritance. She was trying to destroy my reputation, my professional credibility, and my social connections to force me back into dependence on the family. "She also called your employer," Marcus continued. "Told them you'd inherited money and were making erratic decisions that might affect your judgment at work." My stomach dropped. "What did they say?" "I don't know, but she was pretty pleased with herself when she told Dad about it. She thinks if you lose your job or become socially isolated enough, you'll have to come back to the family for support." The strategy was diabolical in its completeness. Create enough chaos and reputation damage to make me desperate for the very relationships I was trying to establish boundaries around. Force me to choose between financial resources and social isolation. "Marcus, do you understand what's happening here?" "I understand that Emma's lost her mind and Dad's about to lose his house, and somehow you're the only one who can fix any of it. And what do you think I should do?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was tired. "Honestly? I think you should disappear. Change your name, move somewhere none of us can find you, and start over completely. This family is toxic, and it's only going to get worse as long as there's money involved." The suggestion, coming from my own brother, was both heartbreaking and liberating. He was essentially advising me to do what I'd already begun planning: build a new life completely separate from people who saw me only as a means to solving their problems. "I might take that advice," I said quietly. "Good. And Jessica? For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the hospital thing. I didn't know about it until this week, but that was unforgivable. You deserve better than what this family has given you." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd received from any of them, and it came with advice to run away rather than hope for change. After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment and made a decision. Tomorrow, I would start looking for houses. In other states, places where I could use my grandmother's legacy to build something positive while leaving the toxicity of my family relationships behind permanently. The victory came through an unexpected source, Emma's own compulsive need to document everything on social media. I discovered it when Dr. Kellerman called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying a mixture of professional concern and barely contained outrage. "Jessica, I need you to know that someone has been impersonating you online, posting content that directly contradicts your medical privacy rights and misrepresents your surgical recovery." She explained that Emma had created a fake Facebook account, using variations of my name and photos she'd gathered from years of family events. The account was posting erratic, rambling status updates designed to look like evidence of mental instability, complete with typos, emotional outbursts, and references to spending money irresponsibly. The posts mentioned specific details about your surgery and recovery that could only have come from someone with access to private medical information, Dr. Kellerman continued. "I've already contacted hospital security and our legal department. This constitutes identity theft, medical privacy violations, and harassment." But Emma's mistake was bigger than just the fake account. In her eagerness to build evidence against my mental state, she'd screenshotted conversations and saved documents that revealed the entire scope of the family's coordination strategy. When Thomas Brennan's investigator gained access to her digital footprint through legal discovery proceedings, they found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Text message chains between Emma, Marcus, and my father showed detailed planning for their inheritance interference campaign. Email exchanges with Rebecca Walsh revealed that Emma had provided false information to initiate the welfare check, including fabricated stories about me threatening self-harm and exhibiting paranoid behavior. Most damaging were her communications with her mother-in-law and social circle, where she explicitly admitted that the mental health concerns were manufactured to force me to share the inheritance. In one text to her friend Katie, Emma wrote, "If we can get her declared incompetent or just isolated enough, she'll have to come back to the family for support. Then Dad can help her manage the money properly." Thomas called me that Friday with news that would change everything. "Jessica, we've completed our investigation, and the evidence is overwhelming. Your family didn't just engage in harassment. They committed multiple felonies." He began reading from a legal document. Identity theft through the fake social media account. Filing false reports with government agencies. Defamation through the GoFundMe campaign and subsequent social media posts. Attempted fraud through misrepresenting your mental state to financial institutions. Financial institutions? Emma contacted 3 banks where you have accounts, claiming to be concerned about your mental capacity and asking them to flag any large transactions. She presented herself as your emergency contact and requested account activity reports. The revelation was staggering. While I'd been dealing with fake mental health evaluations and reputation attacks, Emma had been systematically attempting to freeze my access to my own financial resources. "There's more," Thomas continued. "Your father took out a second mortgage on his house using forged documents that listed you as a co-signer. He used your social security number and employment information, claiming you'd agreed to help with the loan to support family stability. The fraud was extensive enough to trigger federal investigation. My father had essentially stolen my identity to secure loans he couldn't qualify for on his own, gambling that he'd inherit enough money to pay them back before anyone discovered the deception." "What are my options?" I asked. "You can press charges for all of it. Identity theft, fraud, harassment, filing false reports. With the evidence we've gathered, prosecutors would likely pursue maximum penalties. Your father would face federal charges, Emma would face multiple state felonies, and Marcus could be charged as an accessory for his participation in the coordination." I sat with this information for several days. Part of me wanted to pursue every available legal remedy, to make them face consequences for the systematic campaign they'd waged against me. But another part of me just wanted peace, distance, and the opportunity to build something positive without the constant drama of legal battles. The decision was made for me when my employer called on Monday morning. "Jessica, this is Angela from HR. We need to discuss some concerning communications we've received about your employment status and mental health. Can you come in this afternoon?" Emma's campaign had escalated to professional sabotage. At the meeting, Angela explained that they'd received multiple calls and emails over the past week from someone claiming to be my emergency contact, expressing concerns about my judgment and ability to handle client work responsibly. The caller identified herself as your sister and provided specific examples of what she described as erratic behavior and financial mismanagement. She suggested that we monitor your work closely and consider whether you might need professional intervention. Angela handed me printouts of emails Emma had sent to my supervisor, my biggest client, and the company's general counsel. Each message was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about my professional competence while maintaining plausible deniability about being a concerned family member. We don't typically get involved in employees' family situations, Angela continued, but when someone contacts us with specific concerns about an employee's mental state, we have to take it seriously from a liability perspective. What kind of liability? If an employee is experiencing psychological distress that affects their judgment, and we ignore warning signs, we could be held responsible for any professional errors or client relationship problems that result. The brilliance of Emma's strategy was becoming clear. She'd found a way to threaten my livelihood without directly lying about my work performance. By framing professional concerns as mental health issues, she'd created a situation where my employer felt obligated to treat me as potentially unstable. I want to show you something, I said, pulling out my phone and accessing the legal documents Thomas had prepared. My family is engaged in systematic harassment because they're upset about an inheritance situation. This is part of a documented pattern of fraud and defamation that my attorney is currently prosecuting. Angela's expression changed as I showed her evidence of the fake social media accounts, the forged loan documents, and the text messages revealing the coordination strategy. This is extensive, she said quietly. It's also federal-level identity theft and fraud. My attorney can provide documentation to show that any communications you've received from my family are part of a criminal harassment campaign. By the end of the meeting, Angela was apologizing and assuring me that the company would block all future communications from my family members. But the damage to my professional reputation required active repair, and I realized that staying in Fresno would mean constantly defending myself against ongoing sabotage attempts. That evening, I called Margaret Chen and Linda Reeves for a conference call about relocating permanently. The Sacramento properties would be easier to manage if you lived locally, Linda pointed out. There's also a beautiful Craftsman house that just came on the market in Midtown, walking distance from several of the rental properties. Margaret had even better news. Isabella actually anticipated this possibility. She left instructions for establishing a family office structure that would allow you to manage the trust assets from anywhere, with professional support for all the day-to-day operations. What's a family office? It's essentially a private company that manages wealthy families' financial affairs. You would be the sole owner and decision-maker, but you'd have staff to handle property management, investment oversight, tenant relations, and legal compliance. You could live anywhere and still maintain active control over your grandmother's legacy. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Margaret and Linda outlining possibilities I'd never imagined. The inheritance wasn't just money and properties. It was the foundation for building an organization that could continue my grandmother's community-focused approach to real estate while expanding into new areas like affordable housing development and community programming. There's one more thing you should consider, Margaret said toward the end of our call. Your family's behavior has created legal grounds for permanent restraining orders that would prevent any future contact attempts. If you're planning to relocate and start fresh, this might be the time to establish those protections. 2 days later, Thomas filed comprehensive legal paperwork that would reshape my relationship with my family permanently. Criminal charges against my father for identity theft and loan fraud. Civil charges against Emma for defamation, harassment, and privacy violations. Restraining orders against all 3 family members prohibiting any direct or indirect contact. The restraining orders were particularly comprehensive. They prevented my family from contacting my employers, my friends, my medical providers, or my financial institutions. They banned them from posting about me on social media or discussing my personal affairs with third parties. They even included provisions preventing them from approaching the properties I'd inherited or interfering with tenant relationships, but the most significant victory came when the bank that had issued my father's fraudulent loan froze all his assets pending investigation. The house he'd been so desperate to save was placed in foreclosure, his credit was destroyed, and he faced potential federal prison time. Emma's reputation collapsed when screenshots of her manipulative text messages were included in court filings. That became public record. Her friends discovered that the mental health crisis she described was entirely fabricated, and several people who donated to her GoFundMe campaign demanded refunds. Her husband, who'd been unaware of her harassment campaign, filed for divorce after learning about the criminal charges. Marcus faced the least severe consequences, but his commanding officer was not pleased to discover that the family emergency leave he'd requested was based on manufactured drama designed to harass a family member. His security clearance came under review, and his career prospects in the Navy were significantly damaged. The most satisfying moment came when I received a certified letter from my father's attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss mutually beneficial resolution options for the family's current legal and financial difficulties. I handed the letter to Thomas without reading past the first paragraph. Tell them I'm not interested in any communication, negotiation, or resolution. They made their choices, and now they can live with the consequences. For the first time in my life, I had complete power in the relationship with my family. They needed something from me, and I had absolutely no obligation to provide it. The woman who'd been abandoned in a hospital bed, whose inheritance they'd tried to steal, whose reputation they'd systematically attacked, was now the only person who could solve their problems, and I chose not to solve them. Instead, I chose to focus on the house I'd just purchased in Sacramento, the community programs I was planning to establish, and the authentic life I was finally free to build without their interference. 2 years later, I stood in the community room of the Isabella Martinez Housing Initiative, watching 12 families celebrate the grand opening of our newest affordable housing complex in East Sacramento. The building behind us represented everything my grandmother had envisioned: beautiful, sustainable housing that working families could actually afford, with built-in community spaces, childcare support, and programs designed to help residents build wealth rather than just pay rent. Maria Santos, the single mother I'd met at my grandmother's Roseville property, was now the complex's resident coordinator. She'd completed a property management certification program that the initiative funded, and was helping other families navigate the path from rental dependence to eventual homeownership. Your grandmother would be so proud, she told me as we watched children playing in the courtyard while their parents attended a financial literacy workshop. She always said the goal wasn't just to provide housing, but to create communities where people could thrive. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken 18 months of careful planning, zoning battles, and community meetings to convert an abandoned warehouse complex into 36 family apartments. But the result was exactly what Isabella Martinez had dreamed of: housing that preserved dignity while building opportunity. The family office Margaret had helped me establish now managed not just my grandmother's original properties, but a growing portfolio of community-focused real estate projects throughout Northern California. We partnered with local nonprofits to create transitional housing for women leaving domestic violence situations, collaborative workspaces for immigrant entrepreneurs, and mixed-income developments that prevented the displacement of long-term community members. My personal life had undergone an equally dramatic transformation. The Craftsman house I'd purchased in Midtown Sacramento had become a gathering place for the kind of authentic relationships I'd never experienced during my family years. Sarah from my yoga class had become a close friend, and through her I'd met a community of people who valued kindness, creativity, and mutual support over financial transactions disguised as family loyalty. I'd also reconnected with Dr. Kellerman, who'd become something of a mentor as I navigated the intersection of wealth and social responsibility. She'd introduced me to other women who'd inherited significant resources and were using them to address systemic problems rather than simply accumulate more wealth. The most interesting thing about inherited wealth, Dr. Kellerman told me during one of our monthly dinners, is how it reveals character rather than creating it. People who are generous and community-minded tend to use inherited resources generously. People who are selfish and entitled tend to use them selfishly. She was referring to a conversation we'd had about my family, whose legal troubles had continued to escalate even after I'd moved away. My father had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for the identity theft and loan fraud, though he'd likely serve 18 months with good behavior. Emma's divorce had finalized, and she'd lost custody of her children after her ex-husband documented her pattern of manipulative behavior and criminal harassment. Marcus had been discharged from the Navy and was working construction in Virginia, having burned most of his bridges during the inheritance drama. I learned these updates not from direct contact, but through Thomas, who occasionally informed me of legal developments that might affect the restraining orders. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but also no obligation to alleviate it. They'd made their choices based on who they truly were, and those choices had natural consequences that weren't my responsibility to resolve. The most surprising development had come 6 months ago, when I received a letter forwarded through Thomas's office. It was from my mother, the first communication I'd had from her since the inheritance battle began. Jessica, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you after everything that's happened, but I need you to know that I never supported what your father and Emma were doing. I was too weak to stop them, too scared of conflict to speak up for you, but I never agreed with their approach. She went on to explain that she'd left my father shortly after his arrest, that she'd been living quietly in a senior community in Oregon, surviving on Social Security and a small pension from her years working at the phone company. I don't want money from you, she continued. I don't want anything except maybe the chance to apologize. I failed you as a mother, not just during the hospital situation, but for years before that. I let your father treat you like a bank account rather than a daughter. I let Emma manipulate situations because it was easier than confronting her. I let Marcus stay distant because he was following his father's example. I taught all of you that love was conditional on usefulness, and I'm ashamed of what that created. The letter was 3 pages long, filled with specific memories of times she could have supported me but chose silence instead. Times she could have corrected my father's narrative about family finances but allowed the lies to continue. Times she could have celebrated my achievements but defaulted to minimizing them to keep peace with family members who resented my success. I understand if you never want to see me again, she concluded. I understand that saying sorry doesn't undo decades of damage. But I wanted you to know that I see clearly now what I couldn't or wouldn't see before. You were the best of all of us, and we almost destroyed you because we couldn't bear to admit how much better you were at being a decent human being. I'd kept the letter for weeks before deciding how to respond. Eventually, I'd written back through Thomas's office, a brief note that said, I appreciate your honesty and your apology. I'm not ready for contact, but I'm glad you're safe and building a peaceful life. Take care of yourself. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't continued anger either. It was simply acknowledgement that she'd finally told the truth about family dynamics that had confused and hurt me for decades. Standing in the community room that evening, watching families whose lives had been stabilized by programs my grandmother's legacy had funded, I understood what true family meant. It wasn't about shared DNA or legal obligations. It was about people who showed up consistently, who celebrated each other's successes without resentment, who offered support during difficult times without keeping score for Maria Santos's teenagers. We're helping with the celebration setup, carrying folding chairs and arranging flowers on tables. Dr. Kellerman was deep in conversation with a city council member about zoning reforms that could support more affordable housing projects. Sarah was photographing the event for our newsletter, documenting moments of community joy that would inspire future residents and supporters. These were the people who'd rushed to help when I'd had a minor medical procedure the previous spring. These were the people who'd celebrated with genuine enthusiasm when the initiative won a state award for innovative housing solutions. These were the people who knew me as Jessica, the person who cared about community building and tenant rights, and creating opportunities for working families, rather than Jessica the inheritance, the financial resource, the solution to other people's problems. Thomas arrived as the formal program was beginning, carrying the folder he always brought to our quarterly meetings. After 2 years of working together, he'd become more than my attorney. He was a trusted advisor who helped me navigate the intersection of wealth and values, ensuring that my grandmother's legacy continued to grow in ways that honored her original vision. The latest financial reports look excellent, he told me as we found seats in the back of the room. The housing initiatives are generating enough revenue to be fully self-sustaining while still providing below-market rents. The business incubation program has a waiting list. And the scholarship fund has enabled 43 young people to attend college debt-free. The scholarship program had been my personal addition to my grandmother's legacy. Every year, we awarded full college scholarships to graduating seniors from families living in our properties, with the requirement that they spend one summer working with community organizations before their senior year. It was designed to create leaders who understood both opportunity and responsibility. There's something else, Thomas continued, lowering his voice as the program began. The private investigator's final report on your family situation. I'd asked him to monitor their circumstances not out of vindictiveness, but out of practical concern that desperate people sometimes make increasingly dangerous decisions when they feel cornered. Your father is adjusting well to prison and will likely be released early for good behavior. Emma has moved to Phoenix and is working as a cashier at a grocery store. She's following all the terms of her probation and hasn't attempted any unauthorized contact. Marcus got married last month to a woman he met in Virginia. They seem to be building a stable life away from family drama. The information was reassuring rather than satisfying. I wanted them to be okay, not because I felt obligation to their well-being, but because people who are building stable, authentic lives are less likely to create problems for others. As Maria Santos took the microphone to welcome everyone to the celebration, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared, isolated woman in the hospital bed seemed like someone from another lifetime. The person I'd become had been shaped not by the money I'd inherited, but by the freedom to finally understand my own worth. The inheritance had provided resources and security, but the real transformation had come from walking away from relationships based on obligation and building new ones based on mutual respect and genuine affection. My grandmother had given me more than properties and investments. She'd given me permission to value myself enough to require that others value me too. That night, after the last guests had left and the community room had been cleaned up, I sat in my garden reading Isabella's original letter one more time. The greatest revenge against those who tried to diminish you is simply to flourish without them. 2 years later, I could finally say that I understood what she meant. This wasn't about punishment or proving anyone wrong. It was about choosing peace over drama, authenticity over manipulation, and community over control. It was about building something beautiful with people who saw my success as reason for celebration rather than resentment. The woman who'd been abandoned during surgery had become someone who created systems to ensure that other people never faced medical emergencies alone. The woman whose family had tried to steal her inheritance had become someone who used wealth to lift up entire communities. The woman who'd been treated as useful rather than valuable had learned to surround herself with people who appreciated both her resources and her character. I'd found what my grandmother had always wanted me to have. The peace that comes from knowing your own worth and the joy that comes from using your gifts in service of something larger than yourself. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.